The fourth messenger arrived before the third had finished speaking. Job's hands were still open, the posture of a man receiving news, not yet the posture of a man destroyed. Something in his body understood before his mind did. The way a field understands a drought before the first crack appears in the soil. In the land of Uz, on a morning that had begun like 10,000 mornings before it, the world that one man had spent a lifetime building was coming apart, not in one blow but in four, consecutive, relentless, each one arriving before the grief of the last one had found its shape. This is not a story about a man who lost everything and got it back. This is a story about what it costs to remain, when remaining is the only thing left to do. The land of Uz is not easy to find on a map, and that is not an accident. Scholars have debated its location for centuries. Some place it south of Edom, in the arid corridor between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. Others point northeast, toward the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, where the desert begins its long argument with the sky. What is certain is this: Uz was not inside the borders of Israel. Job was not subject to the law of Moses. He had no temple to attend, no priesthood to consult, no inherited covenant to lean on. And yet the opening line of his book describes him as a man who was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. This matters. It matters because Job's righteousness was not institutional. It was not the product of a religious system. It was a personal orientation, a choice made daily, in a landscape that offered no particular reward for making it. Uz, wherever it was precisely, was pastureland, the kind of terrain that teaches a man patience before it teaches him anything else. Long views, slow seasons, the relationship between what you plant in the ground and what the sky decides to do with it. Job understood that relationship. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. A household of servants whose lives depended on his decisions. In the ancient Near East, this was not simply wealth. This was the visible sign of divine favor. A man with these numbers was a man the community looked toward when they needed to understand how the world worked. When it rained on Job's fields, it was taken as evidence that the moral order was intact. He had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And the text preserves one detail about them that tells you everything about the kind of father Job was. His sons would hold feasts at one another's houses, rotating through all 7. And when each feast ended, Job would rise early, before the celebration had fully settled, and offer burnt offerings for each of them, one for each child, every time. "What if my sons have sinned in their hearts?" he would say. Not, "What if they were caught?" Not, "What if someone saw?" In their hearts. He was not managing reputation. He was tending to something he could not see and could not control. And he did it anyway, every time, without being asked. The text calls this his regular custom, not an extraordinary act, a habit. The kind of thing you do so consistently it stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like breath. This is the man who was about to lose everything. And there are 3 things you notice, reading carefully, before the disaster arrives. The first, Job's children are all together when the catastrophe strikes. All 10 of them, at the oldest brother's house. This is not routine. The rotation had already come around once. Something had drawn them together again. Something ordinary, probably. A birthday. A season's end. One of those gatherings that happens without anyone knowing it will be the last. The second, the losses begin with the furthest thing from Job's body, his property, and move inward, systematically, as if whatever was dismantling his world knew exactly the order in which the layers of a man are arranged. The third, every messenger uses the same phrase. "I alone have escaped to tell you." 4 messengers, 4 disasters, 4 times the same words, as if the losses had been choreographed to arrive in sequence, each one leaving exactly one witness. Enough to ensure Job would know everything and fast enough to ensure he could do nothing. He is sitting down when the first one arrives. This detail is in the text. He is sitting. To understand what Job was about to lose, you have to understand what he had actually built, not just the livestock, not just the children, what he had built inside himself, the kind of interior architecture that takes decades to construct and can only be seen in how a man behaves when no one is watching. In the later chapters, when Job finally speaks in his own defense, he describes his former life in language that is not boastful but architectural, the careful inventory of a man who is trying to remember what solid ground felt like. He was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame, a father to the needy. He broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made the wicked drop their prey. He sat at the city gate. In the ancient world, this was where justice happened, where disputes were settled, where the powerless went to be heard, where a man's reputation was measured not by what he owned, but by how he treated those who had nothing to offer him in return. Job sat there regularly, and when he rose to speak, the young men stepped aside, the elders stood, the voices stopped, not because he was feared, because he was trusted. There is a moment he describes, a memory, not a boast, of walking through the city in his prime. The lamps of God shining on his head, he says, his steps washed in cream, the rock pouring out rivers of oil for him. This is the language of a man who once felt aligned with something larger than himself, the language of someone who had known, in his body, the sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He had earned none of this carelessly. The region of Edom, just south of Uz's likely location, was known in the ancient world for its tradition of wisdom literature, sages and counselors who studied the patterns of creation and tried to read the moral order of the universe through them. Job was of this tradition. He was not a prophet in the Israelite sense. He was something older and in some ways more exposed, a man who had reasoned his way to righteousness without the scaffolding of a covenant community to hold him up when the reasoning got hard. His friend Eliphaz would later come from Teman, a city in Edom specifically celebrated for its wise men. The prophet Jeremiah would later ask rhetorically, "Is there no wisdom in Teman?" expecting the answer to be obvious. These were men who had spent their lives thinking carefully about how suffering and justice connected. None of that thinking would prepare them for what they were about to witness. And then there were his children, 7 sons, 3 daughters. The daughters are named later, at the end of the book: Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch, Dove, Cinnamon, Eye of Shadow. These are not utilitarian names. They are the names of a father who looked at his daughters and saw beauty worth naming precisely, who gave them, the text will later say, an inheritance alongside their brothers, an extraordinary practice for the time, a detail so unusual the text feels the need to record it. He loved them, concretely, specifically, in the way that makes loss not theoretical, but anatomical. The feast was still going when the first messenger arrived. The Sabeans came first. They fell upon the oxen and donkeys. They took them. They killed the servants with the edge of the sword. And one man ran. Before he finished speaking, another came. The fire of God. The text uses the Hebrew phrase Esh Elohim, a term the ancient world used for lightning on a scale that felt supernatural. Fell from the sky and burned the sheep. 7,000 of them, and the servants tending them. All consumed, and while this man still had breath to speak, a third arrived. The Chaldeans, riders in 3 columns, disciplined and coordinated, raiders from the edge of the Babylonian world, took the camels. 3,000, the servants dead. And before the weight of 3 disasters had settled anywhere in Job's body, the 4th messenger came. His children were eating and drinking at the oldest brother's house. A wind came from across the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house. The house fell, all 10 of them. The text does not slow down here. It does not pause to let Job react. The messenger says it in one breath. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And then the phrase that has haunted readers for 3,000 years, and I alone have escaped to tell you, 4 messengers, 4 I alones. Job stood up, he tore his robe, he shaved his head. These were not dramatic performances. They were the prescribed physical language of extreme grief in the ancient Near East. The body enacting what the mind could not yet contain. He fell on the ground, and he worshipped. Not because he felt like it. The text does not say he felt like it. It says he fell on the ground and worshipped. Naked, I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. These are not the words of a man who doesn't understand what has happened. They are the words of a man who understands exactly what has happened and who is choosing, in the ruins of that understanding, not to curse the architecture of a universe that could allow this. The text records a verdict immediately after. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. But the chapter doesn't end there, because the story isn't over, because what Job had just endured was only the first layer. The second test came quietly, without fire or wind or raiders. A man sat down on a pile of ash, and his own skin began to betray him. Loathsome sores, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The text uses the Hebrew word shechin, a term associated with severe infected ulcerations, the kind that crack and weep and make the body a source of constant, inescapable sensation. Job sat among the ashes. He took a piece of broken pottery and used it to scrape himself. This detail, this one detail, he scraped himself with a shard of broken pottery because he had nothing else, because the pain required some response, and this was what was available to him. The richest man in the East, sitting in ashes, using rubble to manage his own suffering. His wife stood at the edge of that ash heap and said, the thing that every honest person in grief has thought, and almost no one has been willing to say out loud. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. She is not a villain. Read her carefully. She had lost the same children. She had watched the same livestock taken. She had seen the same fire, heard the same reports. And now she was watching the one thing that remained, her husband, being slowly consumed from the inside. She was not urging him toward evil from a place of coldness. She was speaking from a place of unbearable love. From the exhaustion of a woman who had watched enough and could not watch more. Job called her foolish, not cruel, not wicked, foolish. The word in Hebrew carries the meaning of someone who has lost their grip on the larger frame, someone speaking from pain rather than wisdom. And then she disappears from the text. She simply disappears. We don't know where she went, what she did, whether she stayed close or walked away. The silence around her is one of the book's most haunting omissions. Job sat alone. The 3 friends heard what had happened. Eliphaz from Teman, Bildad from Shuah, a region probably near the Euphrates where a different strand of ancient wisdom had developed. Zophar from Nama, each from a different tradition, each a man of learning. They came to Job together. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. This is not a figure of speech. The text means it literally. The man in the ashes did not look like the man they knew. They raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and threw dust on their heads. And then they sat down on the ground beside him. For 7 days and 7 nights they said nothing, not because they had nothing to say, they would have plenty to say later. They said nothing because the text tells us they saw that his suffering was very great. And in the ancient Near Eastern tradition, 7 days of silent presence was the highest form of mourning solidarity a friend could offer. 7 days, sitting, in silence, on the ground. This is the most human moment in the entire book. After 7 days, Job opened his mouth, not to pray, not to praise, to curse the day he was born. Let the day perish on which I was born. Let that day be darkness. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? He was not performing despair. He was reporting it. The language is precise, controlled, almost surgical, which makes it more devastating, not less. This is not a man raving. This is a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has chosen the most honest words available. He did not curse God, he cursed the calendar. Inside the silence before those words came out, in whatever passed between 7 days of ash and the first syllable of that curse, something had shifted in him. I have been faithful, I have been careful. I rose early, I offered the sacrifices, I sat at the gate, I was eyes to the blind, and none of it held. This was the thought he could not say to his friends. Not yet, maybe not ever. The thought that the system he had built his life on, the careful, daily, earnest system of right living, had not protected what he loved most, his hands. He kept looking at his hands. They were the same hands that had lifted the morning offerings. That had signed the transactions that built the household. That had touched his children's faces. They were covered in sores now. They had nothing left to do. The temperature of ash at dawn is different from what most people expect. It is not warm, the fire is long gone. What remains is cold and fine, and it gets into everything. The creases of the palms, the space beneath the fingernails, the corners of the mouth. Job sat in it. He felt it. That was the moment something inside him that had always believed finally went quiet. Not gone, not destroyed. Quiet. There is a difference. He would learn the difference slowly, but right now, in the ash, with the shard of pottery in his hand, and the sores on his skin, and the silence where his children used to be, he could not feel it. He could only sit. The friends began to speak on the 8th day, and this is where the book of Job becomes something most people are not prepared for, because the friends are not wrong, exactly. That is what makes them so hard to read. Eliphaz speaks first, and what he says is theologically coherent, historically grounded, morally serious. The argument is old and feels true. Those who plough iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Suffering follows sin. The innocent are not destroyed. Therefore, the implication hanging unspoken in the air between them, Job must have done something. Think carefully, Eliphaz says gently. Who that was innocent has ever perished? Job listened, and then Job answered. And what he said was not a counter-argument. It was something rawer than an argument. Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. He was not asking them to solve the problem. He was asking them to acknowledge the weight of it. He was asking them to sit back down in the ash instead of standing over him with explanations. They could not do it. There is a kind of loneliness that is specific to suffering in the presence of people who love you but cannot stop explaining you to yourself. Job felt it now, the loneliness of being surrounded. He could not eat. Not because food was unavailable, because the body in extreme grief performs a kind of refusal. The stomach closes. The appetite goes somewhere that cannot be located. He would hold food and set it down. He would begin a movement toward normal life and stop partway through, unsure what he had been about to do. At night, He could not sleep, and the nights in that region, in the open air of the hill country, were long and cold and full of sound. Wind across the pastureland, the distant movement of animals that were no longer his. He would lie still and listen to a world that was continuing without consulting him. During the day, people saw him. This is one of the details the book returns to, the visibility of Job's suffering. He was not hidden. He was at the ash heap outside the city, where people passed, where they could look at him and form their opinions, where his former stature made his current condition more conspicuous, not less. He felt their eyes. He says so later. He describes the moment when young men, children he calls them, men whose fathers he would have been ashamed to set with the dogs of his flock, mocked him, made songs about him, used his name as a byword, the man who had been trusted at the city gate, whose rising to speak had silenced rooms. He sat in the ash and heard his name used as a joke. The doubt that came was not theological. It was not abstract. It was the most personal form of doubt, the kind that asks whether you misread your own life. Did I deserve this? Not, did God make a mistake? That question would come later, and it would be argued with great force. But first, before the force, came the quieter question, the one you ask in the dark when no one can hear you. What did I miss? Where was the flaw I could not see? Was all of it, the offerings, the gate, the rising early, was it real? Or was it something I was doing for reasons I didn't fully understand? The friends gave him their answers, chapter after chapter. Bildad, sharper than Eliphaz. Zophar, the sharpest of all, almost contemptuous in his certainty. Round after round of argument, each one more confident, each one missing the point more completely. Because the point was not the argument. The point was the ash, the shard of pottery. The cold at dawn, the nights without sleep, the visibility of ruin in a place where everyone had once watched him for signs of how the world worked. Elihu arrived later, a younger man who had been listening, who had held his tongue out of respect for his elders, and who could contain himself no longer. He was angry at Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was angry at the three friends for condemning Job without a real answer. He spoke at length, passionately, with the confidence of someone who believes he has seen the thing that everyone else has missed. Job said nothing in response, not because Elihu was right, not because Elihu was wrong, but because by that point Job was no longer speaking to the people around him. He had run out of the energy required to address humans who were working from within the limits of human understanding. He had only one conversation left, and it had not yet happened. He almost surrendered. There was a moment, the text doesn't name it directly, but it is there in the negative space of Job's speeches, when the easier path presented itself clearly. Not cursing God, as his wife had suggested. Something quieter. The surrender of simply going silent, of letting the friend's framework win by default, of accepting the diagnosis, I must have done something. Let me agree and stop fighting this. It would have ended the argument. It would have restored some version of social peace. He hesitated. He genuinely hesitated, and he did not take it, not because he was heroic, because he was honest. Because something in him, the same thing that had made him offer sacrifices at dawn for the possibility of sins committed in his children's hearts, refused to say something untrue just to make the pain more socially acceptable. It was not a triumphant refusal. It was exhausted. It cost him. A friend reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder once, just once, without speaking. It was not the right gesture. It was too small for what was happening, but it was real, and Job felt it, and for a moment the loneliness became slightly less total. That was all. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, not out of the silence, out of the storm. The answer did not address Job's suffering directly. It did not explain the wager in the divine council. It did not say, "Here is why this happened, and here is what it means, and here is how long it will last." What it said was, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you walked in the search of the depth? Have you perceived the breadth of the earth?" Question after question, not rhetorical cruelty, something more like an invitation into scale, a pulling back of the lens until the frame is so large that Job's suffering, real, catastrophic, undeniable, is placed inside a context that no human argument had come close to approximating. Job listened, and when God finished, Job said only, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." This sentence, read it again. He had known about God. He had been faithful to the God he knew about. His entire life of righteousness had been built on received knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of his tradition, the observations of a man watching the moral patterns of the world and drawing conclusions. And now something different had happened, something that could not be argued, could not be explained, could not be handed from one person to another. He had not received an answer. He had received a presence. The questions remained. The losses remained. His children were still gone. His body was still broken. The world was still the kind of place where a man could lose everything in a single morning without having done anything to deserve it. And yet, now my eye sees you. Weeks later, Job stood up from the ash heap. He did not deliver a sermon. He did not write down what he had learned. He did not go back to the city gate and explain the theology of divine hiddenness to the people who had mocked him. He stood up. He washed the ash from his skin. He walked inside. These were the first steps, not back to his former life, back to ordinary life. The life of a person who continues. 2 months after that, he could eat a full meal without setting the plate aside partway through. This is not a small thing. The return of appetite is the body's quiet announcement that it intends to stay. The day he realized he was going to be all right, he couldn't have told you exactly when it was. It arrived the way that kind of knowledge always does, not in a moment, gradually, and then all at once. He was doing something ordinary, walking a boundary line of the property, feeling the ground under his feet, and he noticed he was not bracing for the next blow. He was just walking. God spoke to Eliphaz. The text records the rebuke directly, and it is striking in its specificity. "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has, not Bildad, not Zophar, not the young and passionate Elihu." Every one of them had argued from within the safe perimeter of conventional theology, unwilling to follow the evidence of Job's actual experience into territory that frightened them. Job had been willing to go there, into the anger, the confusion, the unresolved questions, into the honest conversation that sounds from the outside like complaint and is from the inside the only kind of prayer that has enough respect for God to tell him the truth. The 3 friends were told to go to Job, to offer sacrifices, and Job would pray for them. This is the detail that tends to get lost in the accounting of what was restored. Job, still in his recovery. Job, who had sat in the ash while they talked over him. Job, who had felt their explanations land on his open wounds like additional weight. Job was asked to pray for them, and he did. The restoration came after. The text lists it with the same careful specificity that it listed the losses: twice as many sheep, twice as many camels, twice as many oxen, twice as many donkeys, 7 more sons, 3 more daughters, named this time from the beginning: Jemimah, Keziah, Keren-Happuch, and the daughters were given an inheritance alongside their brothers. He lived 140 years after all of this. He saw 4 generations of his descendants. The text says he died, an old man and full of days, not full of answers, not full of explanations for what had happened to him, full of days, the weight of a long life lived forward. In the presence of a God he had stopped being able to predict and had continued to trust anyway. The final image is not the restoration. It is something quieter. An old man, somewhere in the hill country of Uz, sitting at the edge of his property in the late afternoon, his grandchildren visible in the middle distance, the light, the specific gold of that latitude at that hour. He is not looking at the sheep or counting the camels or reviewing the accounts of the day. He is just sitting. The way a man sits when he has learned, at great cost, the difference between understanding life and inhabiting it. He does not need the whirlwind again. He has what the whirlwind left behind, not an answer but a knowing, the kind that lives in the body rather than in the argument, the kind that cannot be taken in a single morning, because it was not built in a single morning. The price he paid was real, every piece of it, and he counted it, and he accepted it, not because it was fair, but because on the other side of the cost, past all the ash and the silence and the theological arguments that missed the point, something had happened that he could not explain to anyone who had not sat in the ash themselves. He had heard of God, and then he had seen, and now he sat in the afternoon light, full of days. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments. I read everyone.